All right, so most of you probably heard Chris say right before the first song that there's free lunch after church today. Pretty cool. So it's set up. It's just if you're hungry, around 11:30 today, please walk over there, fill up your plate, and we can eat and fellowship together as a church family. That's awesome. But before we do that, we have come first to feed on the Scriptures. So we will do. We're looking at John chapter 1, verses 4 through 13 this week. We're still in that first introductory section of the Gospel of John, which is called the prologue, is kind of the way Bible scholars refer to it. Basically just the first 18 verses of the book, which serve as an introduction, where John really, he's setting us up as readers for what is yet to come in the book. And what John here says in our passage right here today is he's continuing that setup by answering one very specific, but I think very important question for his readers. And this is true of any book, but especially true when reading one of the Gospels, which is, why should I, personally, me, want to hear what John has to say about Jesus? Like, what's in it for me? When I'm going to, spend the next 21 chapters reading this book, or in this case, for us here as a church, spend basically the next year going through it. Why should I want to do that? What's the relevance? A writing instructor, those of you who've ever taken writing classes in high school or college or whatever, they would tell you that you need to answer this question for your readers within the first, few paragraphs of a piece, or in the case of a book, within the first few chapters. Other than that, if you don't, you're going to lose your readers. That is why I personally quit Moby Dick. I don't know, has anyone here finished Moby Dick? Raise your hand if you... I don't think that I believe any of you. If you whenever someone tells me that they finished like Moby Dick, or what's another really long one, Tale of Two Cities, I always figure, they got the abridged version. It's the only real... Les Miserables is another one of those. My wife tried to read it when she was in middle school. She thought she'd be really cool, and it was like a 900-page version. She got to the end, and that is when she realized in the very front it said abridged. She was like, this was the 900-page version, and it was abridged? Very, very frustrating for her. But, if Herman Melville really wanted us to finish Moby Dick, he should have answered this question earlier, within the first 40 chapters. Would have been good enough for me. That's the point where I quit. But John answers that question right here, right from the get-go. He's just said those first 3 verses we looked at last week. Now we're basically in the next 2 paragraphs of this introduction, and right here he is going to tell us why we should want to read this book, why this time that we're going to spend here at FBC for the next year going through it is going to be incredibly worth our while, why it absolutely matters for every single one of us. This paragraph is where John tells us, John 1, verses 4 through 13. A good comparison, again, we talked about this last week, is the way that this prologue functions is like the foyer of a museum, right? Remember this? A great foyer kind of serves as an introduction to the museum. It gives you a preview of what else to follow. Like if you see, in this case, a giant, whale skeleton floating in the middle. You think, well, there's probably going to be stuff about animals in this museum. But it also should kind of capture your imagination or your sense of wonder. Like you walk in and you go, wow, this is amazing. Sign me up for the tour. Here's my $25. Let's go. I'm here for it. I'm in. Well, what we see in this passage here, these next 2 paragraphs, is that there's a whole lot more to this foyer than just something that captures your sense of wonder in the book of John. Because yes, we definitely see a preview of more great and glorious truths that John is going to elaborate on later on in the book. We see more of these kind of key words or these themes that are going to dominate the rest of the story as we go through it. But what we also see in our passage today is that John's gospel wasn't just written to dazzle you. It was written to change you. Personal interest is what we get here today. Not just emotional or intellectual interest, but why this matters to you, to me, to every single one of us here, big time. That's what we get today. So to keep going with this museum foyer analogy, this would be like, let's say you walk into a museum and you're somebody who knows a whole lot about, say, natural history or U.S. history or whatever. You know tons about that stuff, but you don't really know much about your personal history. You could be someone who is like my mother-in-law, and my mother-in-law was adopted when she was a baby, and she grew up never knowing who her birth parents were. And for her, she always had kind of those questions as she was growing up, wondering what their names were, wondering what they were like, whether they were still alive, whether they looked like her, or enjoyed the same things as her, that sort of thing. And what if one day, if you were someone like that who didn't really know your own personal history very much, you walk into a museum foyer, and yes, you're dazzled by the whale skeleton or the T-Rex, or whatever else is in there. You think that's really cool. But then you also notice that there's a banner off to the side, and it says, "Explore our new genealogical research center" on the banner. Trace your family tree for anyone, everyone, using just your fingerprint or something like that. Suddenly, you see that banner and, your heart skips a beat. Some of those old hopes that you've carried all of your life start to kind of flutter awake again. And all at once, this trip to the museum takes on a whole new shade of personal significance for you. You might not just learn about ancient history and whale bones or whatever. You might find something that shapes your story forever. You might not just find cool dinosaurs to look at, but you actually might end up finding your family. This is the promise of the passage which is before us this morning. The promise that this story, it's not just one of dry history or abstract theology. This is a story that can change you right now and forever. That's what John is saying here. If you stick with this tour that we're going to go on for the next 21 chapters, if you follow me around as I show you who Jesus is and what Jesus is like and what Jesus has done for every single one of you, you won't just find truth that is beautiful and is glorious. You very well might find your family. That's what this is, an invitation to a family. Come and see, John says. Come and see your family. So we will. Starting back at verse 1, we're going to start back at verse 1, which we covered last week for context, and then we're going to zero in on verses 4 and 5, the start of our passage here. So here we go. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So, just to be very clear with a point that we finished with last time, Jesus is the Word, capital W. That's who John is talking about every time when he uses the word word. He's talking about Jesus. He makes this explicit down in verse 30 of the chapter, but his readers probably picked up on it a little earlier than that John is talking about Jesus when he's talking about the Word. So this means that Jesus, as you work through this, is also the him that is in view, the word him, at the beginning of verse 4. In him, in Jesus, John is saying, was life. And that life was the light of men. So both life and light are going to be very big concepts as we move forward in the book of John. And they were also very big concepts in Jewish thought at the time. Both actually linked directly to God himself, light and life. God is the source of all life. Old Testament is very clear on this. He's the source of all life, physical and spiritual. God is also the source of all light. There is no other. So really what John is doing, when he attributes both of these qualities to Jesus here, he's really just restating what he already said in the verse right before this, that Jesus, the Word, is God. For example, life. One of the most fundamental characteristics of God, if you were going to list off his attributes, maybe the very first attribute you could put is that God is living. Life is one of his attributes. He is a living being, living in a unique sense, really the most living being in the universe, because he is the only being in the entire universe whose life is not contingent upon anyone or anything else. This is what theologians would call the quality of aseity. All right? That basically means a being who has life in himself from no other source. So God is living, so is Jesus, John is saying. In him is life. He was in the beginning with God, like John said earlier. He was not created. There was never a time when Jesus did not exist, for in him was life. In him, not outside given to him. In him was life, eternally. Think of like a circle or a sphere, okay, with no beginning point and no ending point. That is the shape of Jesus' life. That's who God is. That's who Jesus is. And then, really, that makes Jesus uniquely qualified for him to dispense the second quality, which John attributes to him here, which is light. In him, in Jesus, was life, and that life was the light of men. So light. In the writings of John and almost all Jewish literature from this same time, light is always linked to revelation. That would be God showing mankind what is good, God showing mankind what is true. Think of how we use the term enlightenment, right? Or illumination. Both are linked to knowledge of what is real or what is true. That's the sense in which John is using this term right here. And again, to the Jew, there was only one source of this kind of revelation, one ultimate source. God used mediators at times, but always the source was God himself. So if John is attributing this power to Jesus, the power of revelation, the giver of light, then again, he is simply stating what he already said earlier, that Jesus is God. Jesus is the source of life. Jesus is the source of light. Jesus is God. This is so important to have as a foundation as we move forward through the Gospel of John. This image carries over now into verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light, the true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. So, two major contrasts you need to notice in this chunk of verses right here. The first would be the obvious contrast between darkness and light. Again, if, light is the proper knowledge of God given by revelation, the proper and appropriate knowledge of what is good and what is true, then darkness, basically just think the opposite of that, or the absence of that. That would be the blindness and the ignorance, the finitude that really just hobbles us as human beings as we try to make sense of this crazy, overwhelming world into which we have been born. That's what darkness is. Our finite knowledge apart from God. We're going to have a little bit more on that in a bit. But there's another side to notice right here before we get more into that kind of finitude side of it, is that there's a willful side to the darkness here that just goes beyond human ignorance. There's a hostile side to it, kind of a rebellious side to the darkness. You see that in the description of conflict in the second part of that verse. It says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, that word for overcome right there, it is notoriously difficult to translate. Some of you actually may be using Bible translations that have the word understood there instead, like the darkness has not understood the light. And really, I actually think that both shades of meaning are intentionally in view when John chooses to use that verb here. One commentator actually called this verse a masterpiece of planned ambiguity. I love that description. I would like to think that could apply to most of the emails I send as well. But yeah, really what he's getting to the point is that single word right there can communicate to his readers both senses of hostile ignorance and also just finite ignorance. Like that the revelation that God provides in the person of Jesus Christ cannot be grasped by those who still dwell in darkness. We just can't see it. And there are also, people who dwell in darkness, all of us, before we know who Jesus is and what he's about, that we really don't want to grasp that. We don't want to know God's truth. But there's also nothing we can do to stop it. This is all communicated in that single verse. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not overcome it. It's shining no matter what. Whether you see it or not, that doesn't really matter. Whether you're against it or not, that doesn't really matter. The light is shining, John is saying. So that's the first contrast you need to notice. The second contrast you ought to notice here is one that comes up in the middle of that section, and I would call it the contrast between John and John. Okay, John the writer and John the baptizer. Verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Okay, you read that and you think, okay, well, this is the book of John. We know who this is. This is where he's saying, okay, I wrote this book. I'm here to communicate stuff about Jesus. I mean, it would be really easy to think that because in our English Bibles, this starts with saying the Gospel of John at the top of it. Well, when this was circulating as a scroll, in the Greek world, that wasn't on there. This is technically what you would call a formally anonymous gospel, meaning that within the text itself, John never says, I wrote this explicitly. Now, there's a ton of stuff that points to it. And I think it's crystal clear that John, the son of Zebedee, is the one who wrote this gospel. All right? There's actually, if you remember, you got that handout last week, and it should have been distributed today as well. The white one, did anyone pick it up today or bring it back? Perfect. Go ahead and look on the back of that. There you go. Well done, Malachi. There's actually even a picture of John there. I think Earl sketched it after he had heard one of his sermons. I don't know. That might not be exactly what he looks like. But the John of Zebedee, there's a ton of information right there about who this writer is, his writing style, where he was from, the other information. There's a lot of information about John in the Gospels. There's also a lot of information about John the writer that we have from early Christian sources. They were all unanimous in saying that, yes, this gospel was written by John of Zebedee. And we'll kind of work through more of the internal evidence within the book that points to it as we go through it. But just to be clear, right here, this is not the John that's being talked about in these verses. This John is John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, as we often like to call him. So it sounds like he's, not just the second cousin of John the Presbyterian or whatever, So we're going to spend a lot more time focusing on this John the Baptist, his role as a witness to Christ in the last two messages in this chapter. That's kind of where John steps into the spotlight, so to speak. But we're just going to leave this as a little cameo teaser of John the Baptist for now, but definitely notice the contrast that John himself is bringing up here, which is that John the Baptist is not the light. He's not. He's a witness to the light, but not the light. That role is reserved for God alone in the person of Jesus Christ. He's the only source of light, and oh, how we need him. Really, a fundamental question that every single human being must answer is this: what is true? What's true? This question itself actually comes up very vividly toward the end of the Gospel of John from the lips of an urbane, cosmopolitan Roman official, Pilate. Jesus is standing on trial. He's in front of Pilate, the most powerful Roman official in this land right here, and Pilate asks him, what is truth? What's truth? And I think in a very real sense, Pilate is kind of standing in for all of us when he asks this question right here. What is truth? From the moment you're born, you begin to, none of us asked to be born in this world, but here we are, right? And from the moment you're a little baby growing up, you're receiving input about this world around you, and you're trying to make sense of it all in your mind and categorize like what is real, what is true, what is right, what is wrong. It's overwhelming. It's a lifelong task to figure out, what is true. It's a critically important task in terms of, core beliefs and our behavior. Everything is affected by this. But it is often an incredibly frustrating task, as probably all of us have experienced at times. In fact, there's a really good chance that when Pilate asks this question right here, he's asking it bitterly or ironically even, like, what is truth? We can't know it anyway, so why even bother to try to figure it out? I could definitely see someone who's a jaded official who's been in a lot of politics and stuff saying something like that. And in a sense, he's right. The human mind, as we are born, we're just not equipped for this, really, to make sense of this overwhelming world all on our own. Reality is too vast. We're too finite. We just can't do it. And according to the Bible, really, the problem isn't just that we're ill-equipped. Like if we had bigger brains or whatever, then now we would really be able to totally make sense of the universe and have no need for revelation or that. No, really the problem is that our capacity for seeing and discerning truth is impaired big time. It's warped by the presence of sin in our hearts, in our lives. Sin has affected every single part of us, including our minds. We're blinded. We're deluded. Paul says that our foolish hearts are darkened. It's like, that we have eyes that are open, but we're looking at life in a carnival mirror or something like that. It's all distorted through this lens of our own sinfulness, our own desires, our own wants of what we want to be true, kind of distorting everything. We just can't answer these questions on our own, which is why, praise be to God through Jesus Christ, God did not leave us on our own. Verse 9, the true light, John writes, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. This is who Jesus is, John is saying. He is the true light. True here meaning genuine or authentic. The real light, the light that'll show you what's really going on in this world, in your own heart, the people around you, the one who will show you what life is all about. That's who Jesus is. And this light is for everyone without distinction. No one particular race, no one particular social class or intelligence level or any of that. This light that shines through Jesus is available to anyone with the eyes to see it. This is why Jesus came. He says this later on in the gospel. He says, for this purpose I was born. And for this purpose I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. This is truth from outside our system, outside our material universe, coming in to show us what this world is all about. That is what we need if we're going to make sense of it. The world is dark. Jesus gives us light. Come and see. This is why John wants us to keep reading his book. It's an invitation to know what this overwhelming world is all about. The British physicist Alister McGrath, some of you have read some of his stuff, he's a guy who took John up on this invitation. In many ways, as you could probably just tell from the picture, I don't even need to say this, but I mean, Alister McGrath is like your stereotypical British intellectual. If you were like trying to cast like a little play, and you're like, I want someone to play the part of a British intellectual. Could you just act like Alister McGrath? It would probably work just fine. He was educated at Oxford and Cambridge. He earned 3 doctorates, just because, the first 2 weren't enough. The first one was in molecular physics. He also currently holds a faculty chair position at Oxford University. So this guy, big-time heavyweight, academically speaking. So not surprisingly, from his early childhood on through his young adulthood, Alister McGrath was also a committed atheist. As he puts it, his worldview at the time was one of simplistic scientific positivism, meaning basically all the stuff you needed to know about life could be discerned through science. And anything that you learned outside of that was not worthwhile at all. So really, as you could imagine, within this framework that he had, McGrath saw religion, any religion, including Christianity, as not only unnecessary but harmful since, as he put it, religion demanded disengagement from reality and taking refuge in an invented universe which bore no relation to what I knew from physics. So you notice the 2 contrasting forms of revelation here. One would be what he would put in the category of religion, the other physics. Which light was he looking toward? Well, as McGrath progressed through his graduate studies, he realized that, quote, I had been taught a simplified and sanitized version of science, suitable for school kids and nobody else. It was not the real hard science that I came later to discover. Every now and then, it was as if someone drew aside a curtain, revealing a glimpse of a darker and more complicated world, spoken of only in whispers by those who had taught me science at school. It was as if they had sailed the forbidden seas, to borrow a nice phrase from Moby Dick, but did not want me to go there just yet. So notice that McGrath finished Moby Dick, right? It's what gets you into Oxford, apparently. But his point here is that reality, as he progressed in science, was a lot more complex than his earlier scientific studies had led him to believe, and really a lot more ambiguous. Here's what he said, that as he grew older, he became aware of the need for a bigger narrative, this richer version of reality that would weave together understanding and meaning. Okay, so really he could not find that bigger narrative while maintaining his belief in science as the only and most authoritative source of truth. Now, at the same time in his life, this is when he began to study philosophy. And in his words, when he started to study philosophy, it was as if a tidal wave battered against my established way of thinking. I was overwhelmed. I began to realize that the natural world is conceptually malleable. Nature can be interpreted without the loss of intellectual integrity in a number of different ways. So what was the best way of making sense of it? I had no emotional need for God, being perfectly prepared to embrace nihilism, if that was right, meaning there's no hope at all, just eat Arby's and die. It's kind of how a lot of people describe nihilism. Yet, I mistakenly assumed that the bleakness of atheism, meaning its lack of hope, that was an indication of its truth. But what if truth turned out to be attractive? He continues, I gradually came to the view, winsomely expressed by C.S. Lewis, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. It was as if an intellectual sun had risen and illuminated the scientific landscape before my eyes, allowing me to see details and interconnections that I would have otherwise missed altogether. He concludes, I had once been drawn to atheism on account of the minimalism of its intellectual demands. I now found myself discovering the richness of the intellectual outcomes of Christianity. This is what happens when you answer John's invitation right here. When you see Jesus as the light, you don't just see him. By him, you see everything else. That's the invitation here. Try Jesus on like a pair of spectacles. Try on his teachings. Look through him and see if it does not make more sense of this overwhelming, complex reality we have been born into than anything else ever possibly could, because he is the light. On to verses 10 and 11. And this is where things take a bit of a darker turn. He, again, that's Jesus, was in the world, and the world was made through him, like John had just said earlier, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. What we see right here in these verses, it is a pair of tragic ironies, a pair of really absurd rejections that preview what sort of shape Jesus' life is going to take in this story, and it is not pretty. This is the really first negative foreshadowing that we get in the book, and things are just going to keep ramping up until we get almost to the very end. And think about what just terrible irony this is. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. This is the builder and the architect of the house coming into the house, and the people who live there are like, wait, you don't have any right to be here. Get out of here. This is the playwright stepping into the story, and the actors on the stage are like, who are you? What are you doing? Get off the stage. What right do you have to be here? And then the second tragedy, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. That word, his own there, his own, it almost always refers to someone's house, like his own place. He came to his own house people, and they rejected him. Actually, later on in the gospel, some of you who've read it know that when Jesus is actually hanging on the cross, he says to John, who's the writer of this book, he says, behold your mother to him, meaning Jesus' mother. And the text says, from that moment on, John, the writer, took Jesus' mother into his own, meaning into his own home. He brought her into his house, and he cared for her. Same exact word here for his own, meaning his own house. That's the idea of his own here. When Jesus came to planet Earth, when he came to his own people, these people whom he had redeemed from Egypt so long ago and sustained in this promise of covenant throughout so many generations of sin and rebellion, at long last, the God of Israel had come home to his people personally in the way they had all been hoping and looking for and expecting for years through the promises of the Messiah. And what did Jesus experience? He experienced rejection. Turned out from his own home, from his own people. We really just need to let the irony of this sink in, the tragedy of it. Like for me, one of my favorite times every day in terms of the weekdays is when I come home in the afternoon and I just get like mobbed when I come in the door. I feel like a rock star. You know, I got a 3-year-old boy and a 2-year-old boy, and it's not Shauna doing the mobbing. Actually, before we have kids, it was not the same greeting. Usually I would get home before Shauna, so I would be greeting her. But now that we've got 2 little kids, it's like they hear the door creak open, and I hope I'm not holding like a warm beverage, you know, or something like that, because it is just, I just get tackled, and it's their dad. It is a wonderful experience. I hope they're still doing it when they're 15 and 17. I don't know if you parents of teenagers out there could give me some insight on that. But now imagine basically just the opposite of that. Imagine coming home to your own family, and it's the direct opposite. Maybe you get there and your key, you're like, what on earth? My key doesn't fit in the door? You know, what's going on here? Then you go around the side of the house and you're like, you know, knocking on the window and stuff, and you can see your family in there, and they see you, but they don't want to let you in. And it's not just, we don't want him in a house. It's a personal rejection. It is a rejection of you, the person. And I know that for some of you, this is not even, you know, I'm saying that as kind of an absurd hypothetical situation, but for some of you, this is not absurd. And it's not hypothetical. You've experienced that from your families. Maybe not in that exact same way, but you know what it is like to go to your own people, the people who should love you and accept you the most, and feel a horrible sense of rejection. Or the deep pain that comes when family relationships are severed, sometimes permanently. That is what Jesus experienced here when he came to his own, and his own people rejected him. You know, a second fundamental question that really all people must ask and all people must answer, maybe even more fundamental than that first one, what is truth? It's this: am I loved? Am I loved? Humans are born with a need for love. Again, this is a fundamental question from infancy on upward. I mean, like, think of the long-term problems that can really plague kids if they were not held as babies. Many of you, again, have firsthand experiences with children who have suffered from that. It's awful. Or think of a child who maybe had his physical needs met in his early childhood, but none of his or her emotional needs, emotionally neglected. Think of what happens in the life of an adult when they really don't know the answer to this question unequivocally. If they really don't know beyond a shadow of a doubt on the deepest level of their being that they are really, truly, deeply, unconditionally loved. This can take all sorts of shapes in someone's life if you can't answer this question. You can have the drive to achieve, you know, to just keep like doing more and more stuff to accomplish things to make yourself feel validated or worthwhile. You can have a horrible, gnawing fear of failure, again, rooted in your inability to answer this question. Bitterness toward others. Fear of intimacy. Putting up walls in your relationships. Or maybe a false front that you feel like you have to put forward basically in front of almost everybody. Manipulation in your relationships. Feeling like I need to manipulate people in order to get that love or validation, or else I'm never going to get it myself. All of these signs, and I could list off 100 more, can be symptoms of someone who really doesn't deeply know the answer to this question in a way that's beyond any doubt in their mind. I think maybe the most pervasive symptom and one that is really just a scourge on my generation in particular, is anxiety, which is just a nagging insecurity in life, in yourself, nagging worry. I think it's very telling that in Jesus' longest discourse on worry, and when he's encouraging people not to worry in Matthew 6, the fundamental question that he leads his readers to ask is not, oh, don't worry about the stuff you're worrying about or anything like that. He ultimately leads them to ask, am I loved? He says, will not, the God who takes care of the sparrows take care of you? Do you really believe that God is a Father who loves you? Do you trust that? Am I loved? Well, what John does in the next two verses is not only tells us the answer to this question, he invites us to experience the answer to this question. Verses 12 and 13, so beautiful. But to all who did receive him, who received Jesus, who believed in his name, he, that's God, gave the right, Jesus gave the right to become children of God. Children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. What we're looking at right here in this verse is the key statement of this whole first chapter of John. Really what I would say, the central promise that all the other amazing and glorious things that he's saying are pointing to this promise right here, these verses on the screen. Like if you were to do what Bible scholars would call a structural analysis of these first 18 verses, the prologue of John, you would see that these first 18 verses are laid out in the form of a chiasm. Okay, a chiasm basically being a literary structure, which was very common at this time, still is pretty common in Eastern writing and stuff, where the things that you say in the first half of the piece match up with things you say in the second half of the piece, and they do so in a way so that there's only one part that doesn't match. There's one part that sticks out, almost like in a V shape, if you were to lay this out on a piece of paper. And they do that so that that part that sticks out right there gets all the prominence. It is the focal point. It is like the thesis statement, if you were to use a Western term, that John is working toward in all of this, what he wants to really ring in his readers' minds when they look at this. And it's right here, that central promise. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. It's an invitation to join a family. It's what this is. This is why John's writing this book. And I know that for so many of you, even that word family just brings up all sorts of complicated emotions. Family is the context in which most of us have probably shared some of our greatest joys. Family is also the context that for most of us, or many of us, have received our deepest wounds in family. And that's because families fail. All of them do, without exception, in different ways and, to different degrees, of course, but all families will at some point fail to provide the perfect love that our hearts are craving, that our hearts are yearning for from birth. We will not find that in our families ultimately. And that's because really, in God's design, even the best and healthiest family was never meant to be an end in itself. Just saying, I hope you get all the love you need right here in your family, and that's all you need. No, the love that we receive from our families was always meant to be a signpost, or like a living symbol that points us to the nature of the love of our true family, the family that we were born for, the love that we were born for, and that would be the love that we only receive as a child of God in the family of God. To all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Family of origin. This was like everything in the ancient Near East when John wrote this. Your family determined your social status, which pretty much didn't change your whole life. Your family determined your trade, your relationships, often who you were marrying. That was just kind of, handshakes and sheep were exchanged, and that was that. Determined your politics. I mean, your family is the primary source of identity for every human being who would be reading this at the time that John was writing it. And what John is saying to his readers right now in that context is that in Jesus, that fundamental aspect of who you are changes. In Jesus, God is offering you a place in a different family, his family, the family of God. So what would that mean? What would kind of be implied and carried along with this promise right here? The answer is more than you could possibly imagine, more than I could possibly say right now. Fundamentally, adoption into God's family means it marks a monumental change in how you relate to God himself. Our sin, the wrong stuff we have done, the ways that we have hurt other people and transgressed God's law, our sin alienates us from God. It drives a wedge between us and him. It really makes us an adversary to God. It makes us God's enemies, is how Paul puts it. But in Jesus, through the forgiveness that he offers through his work on the cross, taking the full and complete punishment for our sin. And we're going to hear so much about that later on in the Gospel of John. This is really what he's working toward in all this. But what Jesus did on the cross means that we can now relate to God as family. That's what happens when we receive Jesus. So that we're no longer like an enemy lashing out at God in anger or hiding from God in shame or maybe just living our lives as if God didn't even exist and just ignoring him. Now we can relate to God as a child relates to her father. This is what it means to be part of the family of God. It also means that then God becomes your shepherd, the one who feeds you and the one who cares for you and leads you every single step of your life, the one who in Jesus lays down his life for his sheep. Being part of God's family means that you have access to God's ear, that he listens to you when you come to him. Our Father is how Jesus taught his disciples to pray. And that title, Our Father, it is full of this family significance, that we are a child of God. This is what it means. It means that instead of the self-loathing that you can feel in this world of constant rejection that so many of us experience, instead of just trying our hardest to spin our legs on that hamster wheel of achievement and self-validation, instead of the pressure of trying to make a name for yourself, this means that you are given the family name, the name of Jesus. You take on his name. You take on Christian, bearing the name of Christ. And with that name, you also take on the full and unreserved acceptance that comes along with it. So it's what it means to be a child of God. It means that instead of anxiety, you can have perfect peace. Knowing that family is permanent, knowing that this love that God gives to his children, it is free, it is unconditional love. There's nothing that you can do to make God love you more. There's nothing that you can do to make God love you less, because you are God's child. And in Jesus, you are fully accepted and adopted into that family, now and forever. Now, I know for many of you this might sound way too good to be true. I know many of you might even be thinking, boy, that would be great if I could get it, but this offer isn't for me. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done. You don't know what thoughts I have in my mind every single day. But God does, and I don't think he would have any interest in adopting me into his family. If that is you, if that's what you feel, if that's what your heart is telling you right now as you hear this extraordinary invitation to become part of God's family, there are some words that you need to underline in this promise right here. The first one is gave. What John is making so clear in this primary verb right here is that this is not a family you can earn your way into. It's impossible. This is a family that you're born into by grace, just like a human family. How many of you earned your place into your family? No, it didn't happen. You're just born and there you are. You're part of the family. God doesn't sell this right to anybody. He doesn't yield this right to anybody. He doesn't pay this right to anybody as if, they earned it from him. No, he gives the right to become children of God through Jesus. This is generosity. This is a grace word from God to you without cost. It's really the whole point of the last verse there. John's trying to make this explicit and crystal clear again through negation. He says, you're not born into this family through blood, meaning like, through the right birth lines or being in the right aristocratic family or whatever. No, you're also not born through the will of the flesh, meaning like a natural birth, nor the will of man, meaning anything having to do with human effort or human striving to get into this family. You are born into this family of God, meaning it's God who does the birthing in this process. It's a birth word there, used of the male parent. He begets you, parents you into this family. God cleanses you through his Son. God welcomes you with open arms into his home, into his family is a sheer act of grace. It's all God, it's zero us. It's what's implied when he gives us this. He gives, we receive to all who receive him. Again, notice the verb in this. Receive, it's another gift word. It's a grace word. We don't achieve anything. We simply receive the one gift that matters, that would be the work of Christ done for us on the cross. It's really what it means to believe in his name. It means that you stop trusting in your name, right? You say, I'm not looking to anything that I've done anymore. I'm not looking at anything looking to anything I will do anymore to somehow earn favor with God or earn my status with God. No, I'm done looking at that. I'm starting to look at Jesus' name, what he's done for me. You renounce your name, you take on the name of Christ, who he is, what he has done, and know that all who bear the name of Jesus are dearly and permanently loved by God. Next word you should underline is right. This new status as a member of God's family is not something that can be taken away because, again, it's not something that you earned in the first place, right? Rights are given. Rights are something that you're born into, like a birthright. That is what God gives us in Jesus Christ, the right to be his children permanently. And if all this still sounds too good to be true, if there's still any shadow of a doubt in your mind right now that you wouldn't qualify for this, the last word you need to underline is all. Our hearts will always whisper a million doubts to us when it comes to the love of God, that he doesn't really love you. He won't really accept you. This promise is for others, not for you. But to all those lies, in a gentle, firm whisper, God's Spirit speaks one word back to us through God's holy word. All. All. Find a loophole in that word. There's not one. All. To all who did receive him, who believed in his name, to them he gave the right to become children of God. All. The harlot, the tax collector, the Pharisee, the fisherman, the Roman, all. This right here, this promise of the extraordinary, unconditional love of God for us in Jesus, you are looking right now at the hardest part of John's gospel to believe. There's going to be a lot of crazy stuff that happens in this story. There's going to be food multiplied. There's going to be blind people who see. There's going to be dead people raised. This is the hardest to believe. Right here. Even for those of us who have been Christians for decades, who have known and tasted the goodness of God's love, who've identified ourselves as member of God's families, for years, we often find ourselves wondering, am I loved? Am I loved? Does God really love me? Does he really still accept me? Even after all I've done, has he not given up on me? And if that is you, the Apostle John says this, come and see. Come and follow Jesus for the next 21 chapters. See how he interacts with people. See how he talks to them. See how he dies for them. And then ask yourself, am I loved? Jesus is your answer. Come and see him. Will you pray with me, please? Father, your love is utterly beyond our comprehension. By your Spirit, would you help us to grasp how wide and deep and how long is the love that you have expressed for us in your Son, Jesus Christ. May we know it not just as something in our minds, but something in our hearts, something that flows out of us through the power of your Spirit to all of our relationships. Help us as parents and as families to demonstrate this love to one another, to be the signposts that you have called us to be, so that we might direct all hearts who look at us to gaze upon your Son in worship. We do so now together in his name. Amen.